What took decades to build and is the envy of the world, a network of alliances that has kept the United States safe after World War II, is today, right now, shakier than at any other point, all because of the Trump administration. News breaking today of extraordinary discussions that weeks or months ago would have been unthinkable. NBC News has exclusive reporting that some of the United States' closest allies are talking about scaling back their intelligence sharing relationship with the United States. That includes the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. It's also known as the Five Eyes Alliance. But it also includes Israel and Saudi Arabia, who are having these conversations. And it's because, quote, concerns about safeguarding foreign assets whose identities could inadvertently be revealed. One Western government official tells NBC News this, quote, there are serious discussions going on about what information can be shared with the U.S. The Five Eyes have always worked on the premise that we don't spy on each other. I don't think that's reliable anymore. Tulsi Gabbard and these other characters, I don't think we can have any degree of normalcy in the relationship. That's right now where we are, and I don't see any way that changes. So that's what's happening behind the scenes. Out in the open today, our European allies held another emergency meeting to try to figure out how to prepare for a future without the United States as a reliable ally. NBC News confirmed earlier reporting that there are ongoing talks happening between around 20 countries, mostly European countries, interested in contributing to what they call a coalition of the willing to support Ukraine. It is, of course, a response and a reaction to the events over the last week, the halting of arms shipments to Ukraine, the pause in intelligence sharing with our ally Ukraine, and the ambush of our ally, whose war against Vladimir Putin had once united the West. And in the days after that meeting, the attacks on Zelensky himself. Now, Politico is reporting this, quote, 4 senior members of Donald Trump's entourage have held secret discussions with some of Kyiv's top political opponents to Volodymyr Zelensky, just as Washington aligns with Moscow in seeking to lever the Ukrainian president out of his job. Those discussions center on whether Ukraine could hold quick presidential elections. These are being delayed in line with the country's constitution because Ukraine remains under martial law. Critics of holding elections say they could be chaotic and play into Russia's hands, with so many potential voters serving on the front lines or living abroad as refugees. And news breaking just a few minutes ago, President Zelensky posted on X that Ukrainian officials will meet with his American partners during a scheduled meeting in Saudi Arabia on Monday. President Zelensky says this, quote, Ukraine is most interested in peace. America's allies realigning for a world without American leadership as the Trump administration takes actions favorable to Russia is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. NBC News national security correspondent Courtney Kube, who's bylined on that reporting we read from. Also joining us, former CIA director, now senior national security analyst John Brennan's here. Courtney, take me through what you're reporting.
Yeah, so we have a couple of stories that deal with all of this. One is on some discussions that the Trump administration is having about the future partnership with NATO. So we have seen many of these NATO's countries, they're European Union countries, they are meeting, talking about the future for Ukraine, talking about the future for defense of Europe. And for the first time, they're now talking about it in a way where the United States doesn't play as big of a role. Well, the Trump administration is also doing the same. They are now considering some major changes to their NATO relationship that would include potentially prioritizing the members or the nations who spend a certain amount of their GDP on defense. Now, right now, NATO members are expected to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. The Trump administration has now been calling for that to be increased to 5%. Nicole, of course, the U.S. doesn't spend 5%. They're right around 3.9. But the Trump administration is now calling on all members to increase their defense spending as part of their GDP. Now, according to the officials who we spoke with, the Trump administration is considering pulling troops back from some of the countries that do not spend as much, and even calibrating some of the exercises that the U.S. is involved in, so not participating in exercises with countries that don't spend as much on defense as some of the other allies. Of course, this would be a huge change to how the United States has dealt with the NATO alliance historically for decades, since the Washington Treaty was signed. And it opens up the possibility that the United States would not be there to defend in the case Article 5 is invoked. That is, of course, if one NATO member is attacked, all NATO members are attacked, and they have the option to respond for their defense. That's one of our stories. Another one is on intelligence, as you were just saying. Some of the United States' closest allies and intelligence sharing allies are now having discussions and concerns about how the United States is clearly moving closer to Russia. The Trump administration, with their language, with some of the actions, seem to be trying to have better relations with Moscow, normalization, essentially, of relations. That is causing concern among intelligence allies and intelligence officials who are now questioning whether sharing some of the most sensitive information with the United States could potentially compromise foreign assets. Of course, those are individuals responsible for gathering intelligence all around the world. It's one of the most sacrosanct parts of intelligence gathering, of the intelligence world, is keeping their identities and keeping those individuals safe. Some of these allies are now concerned that they cannot rely on the United States to do that, Nicole.
Courtney, can you just sort of, with all of your knowledge of that building behind you, just put into context how significant a shift this would be for not just the military, but the entire national security apparatus?
I mean, I don't know of a shift that would be more significant from a military perspective than this would be, if in fact the United States really pulls back from NATO, and really decreases support for NATO. Think about it. The United States has troops throughout I think all of these NATO countries, but if not all, most of these NATO countries, and in some cases, thousands of troops. They have combatant command headquarters there. They conduct exercises with these allies. Week after week, year after year, the United States does rotations of brigades into Europe as part of this big deterrence initiative. Not having the close relationship, the working relationship on a military-to-military relationship with NATO and with these partners would be one of the biggest departures for the United States military that we've seen in decades, Nicole.
Director Brennan, let's take the two pieces of reporting separately, and let's start with Courtney's second piece of reporting. This was a question I've been asking on and off of television for the better part of 9 months. What would the impact be to the intelligence sharing agreements if Trump were to seem to align with Putin? Well, he's as always, he's 10 steps ahead of where everyone thinks the Trump story is going to go, and he's publicly aligning with Putin. He's castigating America's ally in the Oval Office and publicly saying the things that Putin would say had he been sitting on that couch next to J.D. Vance. I wonder what you make of how much of the discussions about stopping the flow of intelligence among our allies is about what they're saying it's about, and how much of it is about all of this being shared with Russia.
This is also damaging and dangerous for U.S. national security interests, Nicole. It is unsurprising that our partners and allies around the world, especially in Europe, are now reevaluating what it is they want to do in terms of sharing information and intelligence with the U.S. The strength of the U.S. intelligence community over the course of many decades has been a result of all of those relationships that we've forged around the globe with intelligence and security services. As good and as big as U.S. intelligence is, we rely heavily on these other countries and these services in order to provide us the type of access and information that we need, because we really need to have them. They have some unique accesses and presence. And as Courtney said, it's not just the concerns about the identities of their human sources. That's absolutely critical to them. But it's also some of their technical collection systems. And the fact that the Trump administration now is cozying up to Russia, they really have to ask themselves, how can they trust the United States to share with the United States intelligence agencies the most sensitive information that they have and intelligence that they gather? Because it could be compromised as a result of Trump's whims to direct the heads of the intelligence agencies to share information. Maybe he wants to give Putin, some type of insight into why we know certain things about what's going on inside of Ukraine or other places. So again, I can see that this is going to be a snowballing effect. as more and more services around the globe ask themselves, how can they rely on the U.S. in terms of sharing those secrets with us?
Can you also speak to the first piece of reporting about, and I always think it's important when you talk about NATO, because I didn't know this until I went to work in government, and I obviously worked in government on 9/11, but the only country that's actually, to put it in terms that Trump relates to, taken a withdrawal from the Article 5 commitment is the United States of America. Article 5 says if any of your allies are attacked, you will defend them. We're the only ones that have cashed that out. But what does it mean that he doesn't want to affirm that commitment?
It means a lot. The fact that the United States has been basically the leader of NATO over many decades, it allows us to help to orchestrate the various militaries in the NATO constellation, to make sure that there's going to be the coordination, the cooperation, to try to maximize and optimize the capabilities that we have. And so I'm so glad that NATO countries are now increasing their defense spending and investment. That's certainly necessary. But again, the United States really derives such benefit from having these countries and the militaries of these countries be coordinating with us, so that in the event that there's going to be some type of challenge, whether it be from Russia or somewhere else, we're able to respond very quickly. And that coordination that takes place across the NATO community is so critically important to ensuring that we're going to be, it's an effective alliance, which really has been the case for generations. And again, what Trump is doing right now is upending many, many years of developing the relationships, the trust, the capabilities that exist, that NATO has been the strongest and most powerful alliance in the world. And I think we're seeing what Putin has long hoped, that NATO would be diminished, that NATO's capabilities would be decreased. And I never thought it would be the United States that would be the one taking the lead in doing that.
Our top story tonight starts with a really simple point. Can you claim to start a war if you surrender immediately? Donald Trump's often portrayed himself, sometimes politically effectively, as a, quote, tough warrior, picking fights, winning showdowns, treating everything in politics and governing as just another battle. It's a kind of endless performance of the Braveheart type character. And whether it's true or not, whether it makes sense or not, whether it's strong leadership or not, Trump sees himself as that sort of individual. And he presents himself that way. But that's just the show. What we're dealing with, and it affects a lot of people's lives and jobs tonight, is how that show crumbles at Trump's own chosen battles. He is surrendering right now as president in his promised trade war, caving on the tariffs he threatened, vowed, and then very briefly started. He's reversing himself because of reality. The show, the Braveheart, the movie, the imagery, all of that may work some of the time on some of the people who want to believe what he says. But now there's been a reality check in the markets and from the public, and Trump is basically backing down on the new promised tariffs across North America. He says for at least a month, but it might be forever. It's the opposite of what he, in Braveheart mode, said he would do at the start of this very week.
On the tariffs, is there any room left for Canada and Mexico to make a deal before midnight? And should we expect those Chinese tariffs, the extra 10%, to take
no room left for Mexico or for Canada? No, the tariffs, they're all set. They go into effect tomorrow.
That's it, except it's not. He has backed down, ending the week, I guess, going into tomorrow, Friday, in the opposite form that he started the week. But again, this is not a movie. There are real people's lives, real jobs, real impacts, even if it's a short, sort of wasted set of time. And it's a turnaround, a withdrawal, a surrender, if you will, so abrupt that many experts and consumers and business owners are reeling.
The tariff hokey pokey, as one viewer says.
Roller coaster.
Yeah.
President Trump has flipped on tariffs again.
Mexico will not be required to pay tariffs on anything that falls under the USMCA.
The market is obviously not calming down, even with the recent announcement literally just minutes ago that tariffs had been paused.
Look, this is all stuff that's happening literally in the last couple hours.
Of pause on tariffs for 1 month, essentially, leaves this in limbo.
It is fast moving.
The limbo, the fast-moving problems are crashing the actual markets. This is just the Dow Jones, one indicator. But there's wider pessimism about what it means to have a Trump term, which, according to the current plan, of course, runs about 4 years. And so the folks who saw this from a sort of lower taxes conservative prism, the Wall Street folks and others, are now really concerned about more than just tariffs and that lost market value I showed you. The Economist is a right-of-center international magazine, and it shows Trump basically with the gas setting fire to money or the American dollar or the global economy. And Trump allies admit Americans are getting hurt. Here's one of the members of leadership, top 3 in the GOP House.
The American public may ultimately have to actually pay more for that rather than less.
Andrew, I'm not disputing that. There may be some short-time disruption that's going to result in some negative impacts, no question.
Disruption, negative impacts. Always be careful, I told you this earlier this week, when elites who have a lot of power or money or both start melting down and not using English. Because what we're talking about is your prices going up, your job picture going down, and a bunch of government cuts in between that we've also cut, we've also covered, that are a part of what's affecting people. So I can show you employers are seeing the highest layoff level since the 2020 pandemic. Here's a Trump economic veteran, Larry Kudlow, who served in the first term, with a warning.
Some very, very smart people are telling me that the jobs number that's coming out, the February jobs number that's coming out Friday, could be flat, even negative.
So this is the baseline reality. I mentioned, and it is relevant that Donald Trump may see this as a show because it explains why he's putting certain priorities above your welfare, or he may not care about the short-term loss of all of that economic value and the small businesses affected if he wanted to say on Monday he was starting a trade war, even if by Thursday he's backing down. But when you look at the broader plans, which America and the world are going to live with for however many years we go through here, 4 years of the Trump term, we had a speech to Congress that did not actually make proposals on the number one issue, as the Washington Post reminded everyone, the economy. And Americans are continuing to pay the higher prices and the price of this kind of choppy, chaotic trade war leadership. Egg prices rising 40%. The Trump administration doesn't have serious plans. They have literally suggested people maybe just start raising their own chickens so they could eventually get enough eggs that might somehow be lower priced than the Trump economy egg prices. Yes. Trump is making America raise chickens again.
The sound of chickens in the coop. You might think you were out on the farm, but increasingly you might just be in the backyard.
Some people are starting to wonder if backyard chickens are the solution.
Some people are taking matters into their own hands, building backyard coops, buying chickens, doing what they can.
I bought 4 chickens knowing nothing about the chickens.
Now she gets fresh eggs every day.
We got 4 eggs.
At feed stores like this in Aloha, you're going to want to move up that pecking order if you want to take home some backyard chickens. For example, representatives say last Friday alone, they sold 99 chicks in 40 minutes, the fastest they can remember.
I got 99 chickens, and eggs are really expensive. I don't know. Shout out to the chicken pun in the local news. We, as peers, appreciate that. And, of course, there's a rich farming tradition in this and many other countries. But what we're witnessing is not some newfound embrace of steampunk-style throwbacks to a different style of living. We are witnessing a very rich country governed in a very chaotic manner that has people so pressed on egg prices, job losses, car prices, whiskey tariffs, that a lot of folks are already trying to make up new solutions on the home front if they cannot expect any actual leadership out of Donald Trump's Washington.
We're joined by NBC News White House correspondent Aaron Gilchrist, our Melanie Zanona on Capitol Hill, along with a pair of MSNBC political analysts, Republican strategist Rick Tyler and Democratic strategist Basil Smikle. So, Aaron, first, on the markets, the president issued a reprieve on some of the tariffs, but this is not having a positive impact on the market. What exactly is the latest on this?
Well, Jose, we know that the markets don't like uncertainty, and there's still some of that as it relates to what these tariffs are going to look like, both coming from the United States and from our neighbors to the north and south. We know that President Trump yesterday decided that he would allow a bit of a pause for automakers in particular as it relates to these tariffs for 1 month. So that would give them some more time to sort of build in plans for this tariff or for a deal to be made between the United States, Canada, and Mexico that would keep this 25% tariff from going into effect and, in effect, raising the costs of automobile production and the costs that would eventually be passed on to consumers. But there is still some uncertainty about exactly how all this is ultimately going to play out. We know that the Mexican government is still looking at the potential for it to institute similar tariffs on the United States. The Canadians have made the same effort on their end, knowing still that the president has spoken with the Canadian Prime Minister. There were signs that that call was amicable, although it didn't change the reality in terms of the math on all this. And then there's potentially a call with the Mexican president happening this week as well, Jose. And so I think that uncertainty is still something that the markets are dealing with, and that it seems to be having some impact on what the numbers look like coming out of the Dow, at least at this point in the morning.
And so, Aaron, now to the issue of the Education Department. Can the executive abolish a federal agency?
So the new Education Secretary, Linda McMahon, acknowledged during her confirmation hearing that Congress would need to get involved in order to eliminate, to totally do away with the Department of Education. She seemed to indicate then that her goal really was to make sure that there were more efficiencies as it relates to what the federal government does with education policy, with education dollars, with education programs. We saw a message come out from the new Secretary of Education where she essentially said that she is aligned with President Trump in wanting to send education back to the states, send the responsibility for education back to the states. You can see part of her message on the screen here, and she says, "This is our opportunity to perform one final unforgettable public service to future generations of students. I hope you will join me in ensuring that when our final mission is complete, we will all be able to say that we left American education freer, stronger, and with more hope for the future." She said that the act of restoring education responsibility to the states would be one that would impact both staffing, budgets, and operations at the federal agency. Jose, it's worth pointing out that we don't know exactly when this executive order may come down. The secretary seemed to indicate that it would take months for her to reorganize that agency, to change how it operates, with the goal still being to make sure that certain services, programs are still exist for students, but she suggested that they might be better handled under other agencies, not this 4,000-person federal agency that is the Department of Education.
And Melanie, I mean, there have been efforts in the past on Capitol Hill to eliminate the Department of Education. What are we hearing about this one?
Well, as you mentioned, it does require an act of Congress to abolish a cabinet-level agency. And even though Republicans have cheered the idea of eliminating the Department of Education, this would be usurping some of their power. Now, Trump can do other things, as we saw with USAID, to effectively shutter an agency, such as freezing funding or moving some of the functions around. So we'll have to wait and see what this executive order does. We also don't know when it's exactly coming at this point. But this is just another example of how Congress has allowed the new Trump administration to take away some of their own power and responsibility. I mean, there is some discussion right now of a so-called rescissions package, which is essentially a package of spending cuts as a way to codify some of these DOGE cuts and some of these DOGE moves. But by and large, what we've seen from Republicans, from the leadership on down, is that they are okay with the new administration really just taking away some of their spending powers and some of their decision-making here.
Yeah, I mean, Melody, it seems as though they're in sync, the House, the Senate, being majority Republican, and the executive on these different policies. Now, Rick, Republicans have been talking about elimination of the Education Department for some time now, right? I mean, but outside of the GOP, polls show it's not popular, at least from, for example, this latest Marist NPR poll. 63% of Americans oppose or strongly oppose it. This includes 64% of independents. These are the oppose the elimination of the department. Do you think that this politically could backfire?
It absolutely could backfire because this is a political process. The Department of Education has been opposed by Republicans and particularly conservatives since Jimmy Carter initiated the Department of Education many years ago. And it was a rallying cry during the Reagan administration. But the problem is that people hear when you want to eliminate the Department of Education that you don't care about education, you don't care about kids. The truth is that I don't know why McMahon said return the responsibility back to the states, because, in fact, the responsibility already resides with the states. Most of the funding for education comes from property tax and local communities. You have thousands of school board members, school board superintendents, and they control the curriculums and the funding for education in the states. So we can argue about whether the Department of Education, what its function is, or whether it needs to be reformed. I would say it does. I think a lot of the government does need to be reformed, and this is the thematic that we're seeing all over the place. And I'm surprised it's taking this long, because you can liken the government to an assembly line in the industrial age when it required thousands and thousands of people to make it work. And you can't just go and fire people from that assembly line and because production would come down to zero because of the way it's worked. A modern assembly line takes dozens of people because it's all been automated. And despite what Trump wants you to think, these jobs didn't go overseas. They've been automated. But the government has been hopelessly behind the private sector. And now it's sort of coming to light that there is so many inefficiencies in the government. I, however, do not believe that the average federal employee is either lazy or unproductive. I just think they work in a system that is so antiquated that it needs to be updated so it works like a modern assembly line and not like an industrial or agrarian assembly line, and then we can make some real progress. I don't think this is the right way to go about it. I think you just start firing people, you're going to run into some real problems, and there will be a disaster along the way. And then you have, coupled with that, as you just mentioned, Jose, is the political problem. If you have 63% of the American people, which I would call a pretty strong majority, who do not want to abolish the Department of Education, because what they hear is that you are against education, you are going to have a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, and Basil, you actually teach a class on federal education policy. The president and, others, and Rick was just saying about how this has been a theme, right, among Republicans, especially going back, Reagan, right after Carter started the process of creating the education department. But this whole issue of it's time to send the money back to the states, let them who are the best equipped to know what their educational needs are for their state. The federal government does, however, fund education for the different states. And we're talking about, tens of millions of dollars. What is the role of the education department?
Well, sure. And to be clear, at most, it's 5% of the federal budget. So we're not talking a lot of money when you consider the entire federal budget.
It's still billions.
Yes, but again, 5% of trillions of dollars in the federal budget is not something that I think most voters would say would be in and of itself wasteful. But when you think about, and Rick is right, when you think about the way that the education department is structured in education broadly, yes, most of the decision making is at the state level. That majority of the schools in our country are paid by local property taxes. And yeah, curriculum is in many ways controlled by local school boards. So to me, what this argument is, it's not necessarily about actual education, because what the department does is it collects data on whether or not curriculum actually is working for our students. It tries to associate school districts and states in cobbling together what the best practices that are occurring across the country. And of course, the president can use the Department of Education for his or her bully pulpit. But what this really is about is returning to states' rights. And why is that critical? Because particularly after Brown versus Board of Ed and during the Civil Rights era, you had a lot of southern states use the issue of states' rights to create segregation academies, to keep African-American students from going to school with white students. So there were ways to, quote, privatize, even within the public school system, schools and districts so that you could keep integration from actually taking place. And if you remember, during the 2020 debate, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden actually got into a little tiff around the federal role of education
and busing.
And Kamala Harris was saying the federal government needed to step in. Joe Biden kept saying, well, it was a states' rights issue. But both are correct in the sense that when states weren't following the federal mandate, individuals, families would have to go back to the federal government and the courts to get them to enforce. So when you close the Department of Education, you close a lot of that enforcement to make sure that something like integration and the Supreme Court's interest in pushing for integration gets followed.
And yet, Basil, much of the progress that was handled, and we let's never forget those images, right? Of, starting with Governor Wallace to JFK's role in guaranteeing that that little kids could go to school. That was before the Department of Education existed.
That's exactly right. Ruby Bridges in that famous Norman Rockwell painting, right? So all of those images that we see of young African Americans trying to go to school, the Department of Education in many ways was set up to make sure that what was decided at the Supreme Court and what we believed as a country was important to integrate students would be enforced.
Congressional Republicans were reportedly caught off guard when President Trump attacked the CHIPS and Science Act during his joint address.
Your CHIPS Act is a horrible, horrible thing. We give hundreds of billions of dollars, and it doesn't mean a thing. They take our money and they don't spend it. You should get rid of the CHIP Act, and whatever's left over, Mr. Speaker, you should use it to reduce debt, or any other reason you want to.
While members of the party instinctively stood up and clapped in the moment, there's actually little momentum among GOP lawmakers to repeal the bipartisan legislation. NBC News reports, though Republicans were aware of Trump's opposition to the legislation, senior lawmakers were not given a heads up that Trump would make those demands during his joint address, and they have no plans to take up a repeal of the law anytime soon. The CHIPS Act passed with more support from both parties and was signed into law by President Biden in 2022. It allocated billions of dollars in funding to boost production of semiconductors and chips in the United States. It also increased funding for research and development. House Speaker Mike Johnson told reporters yesterday he would wait to see how President Trump handles the legislation when the White House reveals its budget proposal. But some Republican senators that voted for the bill are speaking out.
The CHIPS and Science Act, at least the CHIPS portion, has mostly been implemented. It's been one of the greatest successes of our time.
Generally speaking, I want to bring chip manufacturing here, but if he's got a different way to do it, I'm open-minded.
Do you support a repeal?
I don't think that's likely to happen.
All right, joining us now, the host of Way Too Early, Ali Vitale, White House correspondent for Reuters, Jeff Mason, and MSNBC political analyst, Elise Jordan. So, Ali, they seem a little caught off guard there.
They were caught off guard there, especially because this is a bipartisan bill that was then later being built upon. Just in the last week or so, Trump announcing more investments into the production of semiconductors and chips. So as I was talking yesterday with Congresswoman Haley Stevens, who is someone that backed this bill, but then also was hoping to build upon it in bipartisan fashion during this Congress, she said she spoke with Republican senators who were very flummoxed by this. And you can even see it from the conversations that they're having there on the Hill, the instinctive clapping, and then the wait, what was that? As Republicans are, again, trying to orient themselves within Trump's Washington. But, Jeff, again, this is something that the White House was building on, the investment structure that the CHIPS Act actually created for them just a few years ago.
And as we've already said, it was bipartisan. It's something that both sides have seen as a success. I think politically, it's also kind of another example of all things that were Biden for Trump are bad. Yeah. And he doesn't distinguish between things that were just Democratic efforts or just Biden White House efforts, but also something that had support from both sides of the aisle and that has this common goal of bringing chips manufacturing back to the United States, which is an economically positive thing, regardless of who's in the White House.
Sam, how much communication is there at the moment between the White House and Republican members on something like this? Who would have got a heads up? How much pushback is there starting to be from members on the House when they're not happy with something the White House is announcing?
Right. So there is communication, right? They are in touch with Hill constantly, but that doesn't mean it's always constructive or always fruitful. In particular, over the past couple of days and weeks, what we've seen is that Republicans feel like Doge and Elon Musk have just kind of gone off the rails a little bit, that they're making these indiscriminate cuts to programs and to personnel in ways that are affecting their constituents in their districts. And so yesterday, Elon Musk's on the Hill, and he's getting an earful from both House and Senate Republicans, a respectful earful, I should say, about that they need more coordination, that they need to get a heads up when some cut is going to happen. And Musk's response to them is, look, I don't bat 1,000. Like, I can't, not everyone can hit him out of the park. And here's my cell phone number in case you want me to reverse a cut that I've made. Now, of course, that's the most idiotic way to do governance. You should probably have a better plan on the front end before reversing it on the back end. But that's what the system is. And I will just say, and I'll leave it here, the frustration is not just from Republicans on the Hill towards Musk. It's from Trump allies off the Hill towards Musk, because they want to actually reduce the government in a long-standing, comprehensive, and in a way that will stand the test of time. And they believe that Musk is doing this in a way that is actually going to fail, because it will be beaten down by courts and then reversed when the next president, Democratic president, comes into office.
Yeah, and you make the point of what's happening on the Hill as Musk physically went there yesterday. Billionaire Elon Musk meeting with Senate Republicans behind closed doors to discuss the sweeping cuts that his Doge team is making across government agencies. During that meeting, senators reportedly told Musk not just the frustrations that you're talking about, Sam, but that his department's aggressive moves to shrink the federal workforce will need a vote at some point on Capitol Hill, which everyone has been saying. Senators explained how Congress could codify those cuts by passing a rescission package, which is an obscure legislative tool. According to NBC News, multiple senators and Musk were surprised to learn there was a viable legislative pathway to making Doge's cuts permanent. Senator Lindsey Graham told reporters Musk was so happy when he heard the news, he pumped his fists and danced. And, you know, credit to my colleagues and friends in the Capitol Hill press corps who said, hey, Elon Musk, if you're giving out your phone number, you want to give it to us, too. I think a lot of us have questions about how this is actually being implemented here, Jeff.
Also, just such an interesting example of government 101 that this top advisor now to President Trump is learning that, oh, there's actually a legislative way to do this. There's a way to do this that's legal, that might actually be permanent, to achieve some of the goals that he's trying to achieve on behalf of the president, but has been doing so far in a way that is not landing well with Republicans or Democrats.
Yeah, there's a legislative branch.
Yeah, well,
it's the power of the purse, right?
And let's talk about the Democrats for a minute, because after James Carville's op-ed saying they should play possum, and then we saw them at the State of the Union, with some dissent in a kind of a slightly weird way. What's the current thinking, Jeff, amongst Democrats on what the strategy is? I know they're hoping that there's overreach. They're hoping that, you know, something happens with Medicaid that spooks voters. But is that a kind of wishful thinking on behalf of the Democrats?
I think just
given the polling around the Doge issues in the country still?
Yeah, I think just watching that address, which was not officially a State of the Union, and watching the response from the Democrats underscores the fact that they're not all on the same page and that there isn't really a strategy. There isn't a singular leader. There isn't a singular figurehead. You had some people wearing pink. You had others holding these little paddles. That was
basically the split between the Progressive Caucus and the centrists.
That's certainly part of it. And I think it's also just a sign of the fact that the party is in the wilderness. They had an opportunity that night to show a little bit of resistance. It's the first time really since President Trump's inauguration that they also had a spotlight, and it just didn't work.
Jonathan Lemire, you know, there's been this conventional wisdom almost from the beginning of the relationship that Donald Trump would sour on Elon Musk, that this town isn't big enough for the two of them, that his ego wouldn't allow him to have so much of the spotlight. And yet he has him stand up in cabinet meetings and hold court. He seems to like having him around. He, of course, invited him to the joint session the other night and they gave him a standing ovation up there in the gallery. What is your sense from your reporting about how this relationship is going and the job he thinks Elon Musk is doing?
No, I'm told right now the relationship is still pretty solid. That Trump is very flattered, remains flattered at Musk's willingness to work for him. This is the world's richest person, and yet he is taking a secondary role to Donald Trump. We know how much Trump respects wealth. He also does think, I'm told Musk is largely doing a good job. There's been some frustration in Trump's inner circle, Chief of Staff Susie Wiles and others, about how Musk is going about doing this. But Trump feels like, and he hasn't agreed with everything, but has largely backed what Musk has been up to this point. And also, I think this is important. Fair or not, Trump views Musk as sort of a heat shield, that he's taking a lot of the criticism, including from Republicans. We heard it yesterday on the Hill, that Trump does therefore not have to take, Elise, that he's sort of provided a little bit of protection. Now, everyone I talk to in the Trump orbit thinks eventually this bromance will probably peter out, whether it's an abrupt firing or simply Musk eventually leaves. I don't think we should expect Musk to be in there all 4 years. But right now, anyway, they think he's doing something useful. But my question to you is, it seems like some of our other Republicans might be starting to disagree.
Well, they're the ones who are having to go back to their districts and to their constituencies and answer for the sweeping draconian cuts, and for there being no notice, and for people to be out on the street and worrying about how they are going to pay their mortgages once their job at the Social Security Administration or at the national, weather, if they're a weather forecaster or if they're work for the FAA. So there are different answers that constituents are looking for that these congressmen and senators, they don't have ready answers for. And I think that's why the meeting yesterday hopefully was a little bit of a shock and awe for Elon Musk to see the kind of reality that politicians have to deal with for him to actually go through with his sweeping DOGE agenda.